This house is not only a quarantine house, the most historic house on the island, but it is also a house of pilots, because 5 generations of my family, the Johnson family, have occupied this house and pursued their careers, which was harbor pilot. So 5 generations of my family lived here and piloted ships in and out of the harbor. These are ships that visited Boca Grande, Port Boca Grande, over the years. One is a Japanese ship that was here to load phosphate. This was an oil tanker that was here to supply the Florida Power and Light power plant in Fort Myers with oil. This telescope was used by my grandfather and other pilots to look for ships that were expected to arrive. When they saw the ship, then the pilot boat would go out with a pilot to board it and then pilot the vessel into the harbor. That's a tugboat, a central tool in the maneuvering of ships in restricted areas. That is yours truly, piloting a ship into the harbor here in Boca Grande. This photograph is of the port in about 1920. When I say port, I mean the railroad phosphate loading terminal. Here's a 5-masted schooner sitting at the phosphate dock waiting to be loaded. Over the years, about 20 ships from about 20 different countries came here to load phosphate. That painting there was painted by a local painter named Jack Barndollar. 5-masted schooner, and the pilot boat is just leaving it, hopefully with the pilot aboard. The cupola, which was built at the same time the house was built in 1892 by the State of Florida Medical Board for the prevention of, at that time, yellow fever was all over the coastal areas of southeast part of the country, and it was a terrible disease. The state government wanted to prevent it as much as possible, so they built quarantine stations around the state, not only here in Boca Grande, but in other parts of the state as well, and appointed quarantine doctors to check ships coming in to see if any of the crew had any kind of contagious communicable diseases. So this house was built to accommodate him. And the cupola, it was there so that the assistant or employee of the quarantine doctor would look for the ship from there, and the notice of the ships would come from, believe it or not, if the ship was coming from the Atlantic, which in most cases it was, through the state, through the Florida Straits, it had to pass Sand Key. Sand Key is about 80 miles, or maybe more than that, west of Key West. So when the ship passed Sand Key, the captain of the ship radioed the agent at that time was in Punta Gorda. So the agent would notify the quarantine doctor and the pilots. And so a watch was established to check to report when the ship came into sight, both by the quarantine doctor and the pilot. So when the information came to the pilot and the quarantine doctor, they would start looking for a ship. In the case of the quarantine doctor, the ship would have a yellow flag, meaning that it was in quarantine, which was required by law. So he, the quarantine doctor, and his assistant would look for the ship flying the yellow flag. The pilots just looked for the ship, period, since they weren't interested in whether the ship was quarantined or not, but they wanted to know as soon as it arrived so they could go out and pilot the ship in. Piloting is probably the oldest profession in history. It goes back to, well, it's mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Pilots have always been necessary in areas where the water and the shoals and other impediments are a problem. So local knowledge is essential. And that's one of the things that probably the primary thing that pilots offer is their knowledge of the local conditions, not only physical conditions, but currents, winds, and anything that impedes a vessel. Phosphate was discovered in Peace River, and when the phosphate was discovered, ships came to load the phosphate, which is brought from the Peace River mining area down to the deep water off of Gasparilla Island, Boca Grande. That was, as I said, when phosphate has just been discovered, and they could see, well, it was ships had already started coming to load it, and so they saw an opportunity to become pilots, and they petitioned the authorities to grant them a license to pilot. So that was granted, and that's how my grandfather and great uncle became the first pilots in the family. Well, it happened because I finished my third year in college, and I majored in history and political science. But what do you do with a degree in history and political science? So, and then about that same time, I started seriously dating the woman who would become my wife for 65 years, Roberta Presley, whose picture is right there. I had to make a living, and I was able to, through my family, get a position as an apprentice. Pilots around the country still use the apprenticeship system to train pilots. And so I did a 4-year apprenticeship training with my family and became licensed by the state and by the federal government, the Coast Guard. I had a ship that was anchored up north of the phosphate dock. It had been designated to be the next ship to load. It was anchored, waiting to be loaded, and it was notified that it would be the next morning. It would be accepted for loading. So I moved it down to a position where it would be easier to get it to the dock. I didn't take the wind and the current into consideration, and I anchored it south of the dock, and then when I started to move it up to the phosphate dock, because of the wind, it would not respond to the rudder commands, and it was heading for the dock at full speed. But at the last minute, we dropped the anchor and averted, otherwise it would have made kindling out of the phosphate dock. The brakeman, well, the locomotive, took a cut, what they call a cut of cars, maybe 10 phosphate cars, and out onto the phosphate dock in order to get enough room to position the cars to be dumped where they could be, where the phosphate would go onto the belt. and it had been raining, and the tracks were slick. And when they put the brakes on the locomotive and the 10 cars behind, it just skidded off the end of the part of the dock that had been reinforced for that weight. It went beyond where it should have been and beyond the area that had been reinforced. And so it broke through the dock because there was nothing but just the boards on the dock itself. That was the locomotive that went to sea. Yeah, they had to get a crane on a gigantic barge all the way from New Orleans.